I have been attending the Aldermore Conservatory's Autumn Open recital for 31 years. I know how these afternoons go. The chairs fill with nervous parents and bored siblings, and a handful of us old regulars who come for the music and stay, because the walk home is shorter than the drive anywhere else worth going. The panel sits at a long table to the left of the Steinway, three adjudicators in dark jackets, Professor Aldrich Vane at the center, silver-haired and impeccably still, a man who has been deciding who belongs on this stage for longer than most of the students have been alive. I sat in the third row that afternoon, my coat folded on my lap, my program already annotated in the margins. I had been a music teacher for 40 years before I retired. I thought I had heard everything this hall could offer. I was wrong about that. I have been wrong about very little in my life that matters, but I was wrong about that afternoon, and I am grateful for it every day since. The recital ran as expected through the first hour. A boy of perhaps 13 played a creditable Haydn. Two sisters shared a Schubert duet that was pleasant if tentative in the right hand. Then the stage manager called the name Mara Pessel, and a girl walked out from the left wing with the particular kind of steadiness that has nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with practice. The steadiness of someone who has learned to enter rooms without knowing what they will find in them. She was 14, slight, her dark hair pinned back, wearing a gray dress that was one size too large in the shoulders. She carried herself quietly, and she looked at the Steinway the way people look at something they love without needing to be told to love it. She sat, adjusted the bench, 2 precise turns, no more, and set her hands in her lap for a moment before placing them on the keys. Professor Vane leaned forward. I noticed it because Vane did not lean. He waited for things to come to him. He said something to the colleague on his right. The colleague checked the program. Then Vane raised a hand and addressed the stage manager across the hall in a voice that carried without effort, the voice of a man accustomed to rooms falling quiet when he spoke. A moment. He looked at the girl. Miss Pessel, it has been noted that you are a deaf student. Is that correct? The girl turned toward him with the slight delay that told me she was reading his lips, not his voice. She nodded once. Vane set the program down. I think you will understand that this is a recital for the assessment of musical development. The conservatory welcomes students of all kinds, but I am not certain this particular afternoon serves a deaf child well. There are other avenues. He was still speaking. I don't know precisely when he stopped, because the woman in the seat beside me, I had never seen her before. She was perhaps 40, with the look of someone who had driven a long distance that morning, made a small sound that was not quite a word and not quite a sob. She was, I later learned, Mara's mother. Mara had not moved from the bench. She had read enough of what Vane said. I watched her face. She did not flush, did not argue, did not look toward the wing for help. She looked at Professor Vane with an expression I can only describe as patient, the patience of someone who has heard this before, or rather, has read it on enough faces that one more is not a surprise. Then she looked at the keys. She placed her hands on them the way you might set something down that you have been carrying for a long time, lightly, carefully, as though the keys were the only thing in the room that had not just told her she did not belong. And she began to play. What came out was the first movement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. I want you to understand something about that choice, if it was a choice. I have thought about it since, and I believe it was, entirely and deliberately. Beethoven wrote the Moonlight Sonata in the years he was losing his hearing. He wrote it while the world of sound was being taken from him piece by piece, and he kept composing anyway, working from memory and from the vibrations in the floor, and from a lifetime of listening that could not be revoked simply because the ear had started to fail him. He made something from that silence that has outlasted every critic and every committee and every well-meaning administrator that ever told him what he could or could not hear. Mara Pessel knew this, I am certain of it, in the way that people who have studied a thing know it not just in the mind but in the hands. She was playing the piece Beethoven wrote while going deaf. In this room, with this panel on this afternoon, That was not a coincidence. That was a reply. The hall went quiet the way halls go quiet when they are caught off guard, not the polite hush of an audience settling, but the surprised silence of people who have stopped doing what they were doing because something has demanded their attention. The woman with the program in the second row stopped turning pages. The father near the aisle put his phone face down in his lap. Vane's colleague on the left slowly straightened in his chair. The first movement of the moonlight is all patience and restraint. It is not a piece that shows off. It is a piece that reveals. The left hand holds a slow, rolling triplet, 3 notes, over and over, through every key change, like a tide coming in whether or not anyone is watching. The right hand places a melody on top that does not rush, does not demand, simply states itself and waits. Most young pianists hurry it or color it too much, trying to make it feel like something because they are afraid it won't feel like anything on its own. They apply emotion to it the way you might polish silver from the outside. To play it as Mara played it, you have to resist the urge to make it beautiful. You have to let it be true instead and trust that the truth is enough. She was not making it beautiful. She was letting it be true. At 14, with no audience instruction and no hearing, she let it be true. And because of that, because she was not managing it or shaping it toward some effect she'd rehearsed, it arrived in the hall like something that had been waiting there all along, wanting only to be released. I am a retired music teacher. I was not in the habit of weeping at recitals. I had not wept in this hall in 31 years. I mention this because my eyes filled before she reached the recapitulation. And I mention it further because I looked to my left, and the woman from the second row was holding the back of her own hand against her mouth. And to my right, an older man I recognized as a retired engineer who came to these recitals for much the same reason I did, was sitting with his hands flat on his thighs and his chin raised. The way men of a certain age hold themselves when they are trying to keep something inside. Then the first movement ended, and Mara did not lift her hands. She paused for a breath, 2 seconds, perhaps 3, and then she continued into something that was not the Beethoven. I realized this slowly, the way you realize you have walked into a room that is different from the room you expected. The key was similar, the tempo was similar, but the music was hers. She had moved without announcement into a composition of her own, and what she played was not a student exercise, not a modest attempt at the form. It was a fully realized piece. It had the same patient, rolling left hand, but the right hand's melody was different, more searching, with intervals the Beethoven did not have, gaps of silence between the phrases that were wide enough to feel something fall into. Later, I would learn from her mother that Mara had written it over the course of 2 years, that she composed at the piano by touch and vibration alone, feeling the resonance in the wood of the bench, in the floor, in the frame of the instrument itself, feeling the low notes as a pressure in her chest, the high notes as something in her jaw and the bridge of her nose, the harmonics and overtones as a kind of warmth that traveled up her forearms when the room around the piano was properly still. She had never heard a note of it. She had no idea whether it was beautiful, only that it was true, only that when she played it, the vibration moved through her wrists and her arms and her sternum in a way that felt correct felt. She told her mother once, like the thing she had been trying to say her whole life, said in the only language available to her. What I can tell you from the third row is what it sounded like from the outside. It sounded like grief that had been given enough time to become something other than grief. It sounded like a conversation between what is lost and what remains, conducted without bitterness, without resolution, without the false comfort of a tidy ending. It had gaps in it, rests, silences between the phrases that were not empty. They were weighted. You felt what ought to have gone there and was not there, which is a different thing entirely, and harder and more honest. I have not met many composers in 40 years of music teaching who could do that on purpose. I have met none who could do it without hearing. She played it for perhaps 7 minutes. I know because I looked at my watch when she stopped, and then I looked at the stage, and then I looked at my watch again because looking at the stage was almost too much. Mara sat with her hands still on the keys at the end, the last chord held until it faded, not cut, not rushed, allowed to go on its own terms. Then she lifted her hands and placed them in her lap and looked straight ahead, and her face was the face of someone who has said what they needed to say and is now prepared for whatever comes next. The hall was silent for a moment that felt longer than it was. These silences happen sometimes, in my experience, not the silence after a polished performance that the audience is slightly relieved is finished, but the silence after something that has taken the air out of the room and not given it back yet. The woman beside me, Mara's mother, was the first to make a sound. She stood. She began to applaud, alone in the hall, and the sound of her hands together was very clear in the silence. Then the man to my right stood. Then, 3 rows behind me, a couple stood together. And then the room rose, seat by seat, the way a wave builds not with force but with accumulation, until I was the only person in the 3rd row still seated. And then I was not, because I was standing too, my coat sliding off my lap onto the floor, my hands coming together without any conscious instruction from me. At the panel table, Professor Vane's 2 colleagues were on their feet. Vane himself had not moved. He sat for a long moment while the hall stood around him, and then he did something I have not seen him do in 31 years of watching him preside over this room. He placed both hands flat on the table. He pushed himself to his feet, and he stood. He did not applaud immediately. He stood first. Just stood, looking at the stage, at this girl of 14 in the gray dress who was now looking back at the room with an expression of quiet, complete uncertainty. She could not hear us. She was reading us, reading the standing bodies and the movement of the air, learning us the way she had learned the Steinway. And after a moment Vane began to applaud with the slow, deliberate force of a man who does not offer things lightly and knows it. Mara looked at him. She held his gaze for a second. Then she looked at her hands and her shoulders moved in a single breath, and she nodded once, the same small nod she had given when he asked if she was deaf, but it meant something entirely different now. I picked up my coat from the floor. I folded it over my arm. I stayed standing for a long time after the applause ended, longer than most, because I found that sitting down seemed like a diminishment of something I was not yet ready to diminish. 40 years of teaching music taught me a great deal about talent, about discipline, about the difference between a student who practices and a student who hears. What I did not know, or had forgotten, or had never thought to question, was what hearing means. Whether it is the ear that listens or something else, something in the hands, the sternum, the bone, something that knows the truth of a sound without needing to be told. Mara Pessel composed 2 years of her life into 7 minutes that afternoon, and not one of those minutes was spent hearing it. And yet every note of it was heard. Every note of it landed in this hall and in these people and in me, and I have not lost a single bar of it in all the time since. I have attended the Aldermore Conservatory's Autumn Open recital every year for 31 years. I know how these afternoons go. That one went differently, and I am grateful every day for the difference.